Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me, especially to speak first. It's a very large brief I've been given, literally, what is the solution? So I've interpreted it in my own way, in a way which fits in 20 minutes. So I've instructed Andrew to start gesticulating at me at that point, if not before, just so I don't go on too long and leave enough time for questions. I thought I'd start a little bit with what's the problem. Now, I know this, since I've arrived, I've found out that this is now one of three consultations on the issue of energy and climate change, and the what's the problem part of the picture was covered quite well in the first one. So, but I always think it's better to remind ourselves what question we're asking before we start diving into what the solution might be. So I've just got a few slides on that, but most of it is on the energy system and how it may need to change. So some quotes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a large group of scientists. This is from their most recent assessment report, which is actually not that recent now, it's 2007. Climate science moves on quite quickly, and actually some of the work they've done in there is out of date, and the new assessment is being done at the moment. But this is just sort of saying these are the kind of things that are happening. They're unequivocal about the warming of the climate system to start with. It doesn't just mean global average temperatures rising, but also means other things too. And this is just one of the future scenarios that they had in that assessment report about what kinds of temperature increases, which is the way that climate change is often most popularly expressed. It's about changes in average global temperatures. Through the period to 2090-2099. So they run forward all the way through to the end of this century. And you can see there's a very uneven distribution of those temperature increases around the world, but some areas, particularly I think the North Pole, and some very high levels of temperature increases, which is behind concerns that polar ice sheets may start to melt. So that's one of many specific projections in that report. But I think what I wanted to emphasize with this slide is it's really just about increases. This is a Guardian graphic, but it draws on the work from Tim Lenton and others, very prominent climate scientists, really emphasizing the fact that, yes, temperatures are increasing and will continue to increase unless we do something about it. But actually, there are a lot of other types of impacts that we may need to deal with. So it's not just global warming, it's climate change, and hence the phrase climate change, I think, is a better one to use. I've only highlighted a couple of these. The Arctic sea ice I've already mentioned, and that can, of course, under some scenarios, lead to some quite substantial levels, rises in sea level. Greenland as well, perhaps over a very long time scale, 300 years it suggests on this graphic. But also implications for other areas. So the Amazon rainforest dieback, for example, that's already been depleted by converting of forestry to farming, but that may be accelerated if temperatures increase. So there's lots of feedbacks and unintended, unforeseen consequences there. And maybe some examples where some people call them tipping points might happen, where a certain trigger might actually lead to runaway impacts. So climate change has a lot of things that are already happening, a lot of course, disagreement at the edges about exactly what may happen, and uncertainty, but a very high degree of agreement that actually climate change is happening. Not only that, but actually it's largely, in recent years, due to human activity in the emission of greenhouse gases. That's just what this second quote from the IPCC is saying. So it's global emissions from human activities that are the main driver of the temperature increase we've seen so far, and the further change that is going to happen in future. But when sort of thinking about climate change and what's to be done, there's often been a debate about the extent to which we should actually mitigate or adapt. And just to decode that for a minute. So mitigation means actually reducing the greenhouse gases we're emitting around the world, so that those greenhouse gases aren't adding to the climate change that's already in train. But of course, climate change is already happening, and even if we were to stop emitting now, some further climate change would actually occur, because it's a stock pollution problem, and once emissions of greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, they are going to have an impact for many, many years to come before they get assimilated. And so, as climate change gets worse and emissions rise, and perhaps it becomes difficult to reduce those emissions, there becomes some emphasis on adaptation to do. What would we have to do to adapt to higher temperatures, perhaps rising sea levels, changing weather patterns, and so on? And I've included this quote from Bob Watson, who's still the Chief Scientific Advisor at DEFRA, a former chair of the IPCC, former White House advisor on the environment and climate change, so he's been around a while and knows his stuff. Really to say that, of course, let's mitigate to try and stick within 2 degrees, which has become a kind of totemic expression of what dangerous climate change would be, going above 2 degrees, where the impacts are more expensive and much more extensive. But also thinking about, if we miss that target, what do we do then? So actually preparing to adapt to, say, 4 degrees. In other words, a world where perhaps we're not successful in meeting the 2-degree target. And I thought he put it rather well by saying, well, we should do as much as possible to get towards the 2 degrees, but actually making contingency plans for adaptation at the same time. And they're not either-or choices. So on to what's the solution. And there's lots I could have said here, but what I've done is to give somewhat of a global perspective to start with, but then actually used it to focus in on what's the solution in terms of the UK and the UK's position within the global picture. So these graphs come from a very recent report by the German Advisory Council on Global Change. They released an encyclopedic report a few months ago, which really goes through not only climate change, but many of the other challenges the world faces. But this graphic sort of encapsulates a lot of what scientists are saying. Once you translate greenhouse gas emissions into concentrations, into impacts, and then work backwards from what you need to do to limit temperature rises to 2 degrees, then basically you're left with a certain budget of carbon emissions that we can emit as the world over a particular time period. With this one, they've taken the period out to 2050 and said basically we have an amount of carbon we can emit as the world. This, you'll note from the footnote, doesn't actually give us a 100% chance of remaining within the 2-degree target. In this case, it's a 66% chance. So you're not guaranteed to live within that particular target. But given that budget, what are the pathways the world could follow in terms of emissions? So what they've done, they've taken away historic emissions to the left of the dotted line and said, well, those are already in the atmosphere. And how can you spend the available budget, the remaining budget, on different pathways? And what happens if you delay the peak year of emissions globally to different points in time? So were we to be on a downward trajectory from now, the globe could reduce emissions by nearly 4% a year. But if you leave it till 2020 to peak, if you believe these numbers, then you're on a 9% a year reduction, which is rather unprecedented. I think Russia managed it after the fall of the Berlin Wall, not fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the communist era. But there aren't that many examples around the world where emissions have fallen that rapidly, and certainly not through designed climate policy.
Didn't Durban agree there'd be no controls until 2020?
Yeah, well, we'll no doubt get to that in the debate, yes. But this is what the science is saying. So that's the German Advisory Council on Global Change. What would need to happen? Now, the world is awash with scenarios about how we might actually meet those types of targets. Can you hear me if that's there? Yeah. And this is just another slide from that German Advisory Council on Global Change report. I'm not going to ask you to read any of the figures in detail, but I think the point I'm trying to make here are there are choices as the world and as the UK as to how we meet these particular budgets. So it's not, here is a carbon budget and here is a definite set of energy supply and energy demand measures and behaviour change measures and changes we must make in order to meet that target. There are actually many different ways to meet those targets in physical terms. So on the left-hand side, they've got the history, and then they roll the scenario forward from 2010 to 2050, showing from one particular model how the energy system might change to live within this 2-degree target. So in that case, you see you've got quite a big mix of different energy options. Coal, oil, and gas are still very large in the energy system in 2050. There are, of course, technologies being implemented to sequester some of those carbon emissions. But then on the right-hand side, there are snapshots of 2050 scenarios from many other modelling exercises showing exactly how you'd meet that same target, but using rather different mixes of sources and energy efficiency options. And some of them include, for example, nuclear power, just to pick that out, which is in the orange. But if you notice the bars towards the very right-hand side, they tend to be lower energy scenarios, so more energy efficiency has been implemented. Many of those scenarios, they've decided not to include nuclear power. Remember, this is a German council, so they were very much informed by the politics in Germany and the fact that nuclear power is now off the agenda there. And so they've developed a scenario where nuclear power isn't required. And I respect that this is a global basis. So it just gives a sense of, that there are different views about how this could be done. But in terms of what's the solution, of course, there's very big sort of policy stroke political issues about how you share out that budget around the world, who does what, and then, of course, big political debates about what pathway different countries, regions, localities ought to take. This is just one snapshot which informs some of the politics. This is emissions per capita, not emissions absolutely. We all know that China is now the world's largest emitter of carbon, but these are the emissions per capita as of 2010, just showing that the US is by far the highest. China is very much catching up with the EU average level, but all of these kinds of numbers feed into those political debates at the UN climate talks about who does what, or who doesn't do what, and when change might happen. Just to reinforce that, this is based on some work that I and a colleague did, looking at different ways you can cut up a global carbon budget amongst countries. Were UN processes to work in such a way, which of course they don't. They work in very political ways, and there's no scientist sitting there telling each country what budget they have left to spend. It's done through negotiation. But it just shows a contrast between two ways of doing it, and I'm not advocating either necessarily. On one hand, you could say, well, everybody on the planet is entitled to emit the same amount. Doesn't matter whether from China, or from Kenya, or from the UK. And in that case, you'd end up with China, for example, with 14% of the carbon budget, EU with 9%, and so on. Or you might say that every pound of or dollar of economic output should have the same amount of carbon attached to it, which is the right-hand side. And you can see there's a very different set of shares there. So there's a big ethical discussion about the extent, to what extent you should divide up that cake and what basis you should use for doing that. So, just because we've got these scenarios doesn't mean to say we know exactly how that should be done. So turning to the UK, this is a sort of UK version from the Committee on Climate Change, the government's advisors on climate change, to say, well, not only how do we get to 2050, which is the right-hand side block, where the UK's share of that global effort is basically an 80% cut. That's where our 80% target comes from. It's our fair share of that effort moving towards equal per capita emissions over the 2050 period. But also focusing on the pathway. How do we get from here to there, which I think is the more difficult question. It's very easy for us and for politicians and everybody to sign up to 2050 targets, but actually when you track back and say, well, this is what you've got to do in the next 5 years, the following 5 years, then it becomes more difficult. And of course, not only do we need to tackle climate change, but keep the lights on at the same time, think about energy security and affordability, which has become a very big political issue in the last 12 months or so. Now, how are we doing in the UK so far? Well, actually, on one measure, we're doing pretty well. So if you look at the latest figures which have come out, 2011 provisional data for CO2, for example, you can see we're down 23% since 1990. So we're well on the way to those interim targets the Committee on Climate Change highlighted there in the last slide. But actually, it depends which way you measure them. And there's been also some work on consumption-based emissions. In other words, not only emissions coming from the UK territory, what we emit here, but actually what are the emissions embedded in all the things we consume, all the products we consume, which are often made abroad, or the products used in industrial processes, again, sometimes made abroad. If we do our carbon footprint that way, actually our emissions increased 20% between 1990 and 2009. So it depends which way you look at it. And one way of putting it might be that, yes, we've reduced our emissions, but it's due to outsourcing a lot of our production to other countries. And hence, China is really looking after some of our carbon budget for us these days, and perhaps that should be recognised in these negotiations.
Your graph isn't going up 20%?
No, that's because that's not a consumption graph. So that would be a different graph. So what's the solution? Well, the government thinks it's got a plan. In fact, it calls it a plan, which I find quite surprising for a centre-right government, but they have this thing called the Carbon Plan, which they have to publish every year under the Climate Change Act. And basically, this is just a quote from the foreword, which gives the sense that they know exactly what they're doing, and here are all the policies that are being put in place. The Green Deal, which has been much talked about in the press, which will help cut energy bills in homes, it is hoped. An investment bank for investment at the larger scale, reforms to markets, generating jobs, etc. But again, the thing I'd want to emphasise, just like I did at the global level, that there are rather different ways of meeting these targets. And here I've just picked out two potential pathways, which I could have picked many of them, which are all compliant with the 80% target. This is taken from Department of Energy and Climate Change. If you haven't seen it already online, they now have something called the DEC calculator, where you can actually decide you're in charge for the next 38 years, and we can see how to meet the 80% target. And you can actually set which measures you wish to use. So it distinguishes on the left-hand column between demand-side measures, efficiency in buildings, changing of vehicles, insulating and so on. The middle column, which is all the supply-side options. Which ones would you want to use? Renewables, nuclear power, carbon capture and storage. I've chosen this pathway just to illustrate Friends of the Earth. They said, we're not going to have any nuclear power, we're not going to have any fossil fuel stations with capturing the carbon dioxide from them. We're going to put a big emphasis on renewables and energy efficiency. This combination of options they chose actually meets the 80% target, and you can see that on the right-hand side there. It's the dark line, which is the overall emissions. But equally, and this is the next one I've put in, you could say, actually, we want a really nuclear-heavy future, less efficiency, and again, this meets that target. You'll notice in this case, which is the middle diagram, the level of energy supply goes much higher than in the first case because you have less energy efficiency. So you'd end up with a set of pathways which can then be debated. People will have their favourites, but actually there is a discussion to be had about exactly how we meet this target. Now, of course, so far I've just talked about science and I've talked about options and the amount of energy a particular technologies can generate and how much demand reduction you might be able to do. But of course, costs really matter too, not least in the current climate where people are worried about rising energy bills. There isn't exactly a lot of taxation money to throw around on this problem. So the costs of making this low carbon transition really matter too. This is one of the rather familiar, which some of you might have seen before, McKinsey curves, which very visually kind of nice and simple. They basically line up all of the options you could take to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, starting on the left with the cheapest ones and moving to the right to the more expensive ones. And you can see a lot of them lie below this line, which mean that actually they ought to be, if not free to implement, but actually they should make people money. So in other words, all of those ones which the blue bars are below the line ought to be implemented now already. The trouble with this very simple graphic is it's very misleading because it gives you the impression that actually these are low cost, if not negative cost options, but actually a lot of them aren't being implemented. So insulation retrofits on buildings are happening, but certainly not at the rate these figures suggest. People aren't shifting over to hybrid vehicles in the numbers these figures might suggest. So there's obviously a lot of reasons why people and investors and firms aren't doing these things. Similar sets of figures you can do, and this is another one just again to illustrate the issue for, this is just the power generation sector. You can look at all the costs of different technologies. These are all low carbon ones, so you see onshore wind, for example, on the left, going through some of the other renewables, nuclear is in there, carbon capture and storage and so on. These are from Mott MacDonald, some work they did for the Committee on Climate Change. Again, I'd say they're a very poor guide to investment behaviour. So I'll finish off in 2 or 3 minutes. They're a poor guide to investment behaviour because actually, even if you've got a technology which is the cheapest, there's issues of risk that come into financial decisions. Will investors actually invest in what seems cheapest, or are they going to think about what their competitors are doing and which technologies are most proven and most familiar to them? And of course, last time, you know, we had grand plans, whether it be, and I've chosen a nuclear example here, of course, and I think we're going to talk more about that in some other people's talks as well. Last time we had a big plan on nuclear, which was 1981. We only built one reactor, which is here. But you could say the same about the renewables target for 2010, which was missed by a few percentage points, combined heat and power targets, and so on. So there have been plans to meet these things before. Just to conclude, because I know I'm almost finished, I wanted to just say a few words about, you know, whether or not we can do everything at once, because I think there's a temptation in the debate. Yes, we need all of the options, and it's what many politicians of all colours say and what many supporters of a lot of the options say too. But my question, I think it'd be interesting to debate over the next 24 hours, is to what extent do we think this is true? Do we need to throw everything at this problem, or actually do we need to make choices for various reasons? So, for example, government rhetoric says we do everything. They are putting in place policies to support all of these options on the demand side and on the supply side. But actually, there's often a political debate about, are there alternative pathways? And this is a very old debate, which is why I've quoted Amory Lovins from 1977, saying, actually, physically speaking, we can have everything in the same system, but actually, politically speaking, we can't. And I'm sort of posing the question, you know, to what extent do we agree with Amory Lovins' view there? So in other words, can we pursue all the options at once? Some options are more equal than others. So nuclear has received a lot more support than other low-carbon options we have to date. There's competition for funding. That may be a constraint. But also it depends on visions. You know, which options are legitimate, which ones the public will accept. Are regulatory frameworks and the economic and the markets set up to choose between those on an equal basis, or are there some ways in which some of them are favoured over others? And certainly this point, which I'll just draw your attention to on momentum, is important. Our infrastructures and our institutions, for good historic reasons, tend to favour large-scale supply options, and you can see that in the way that many policies are being framed. So the question is, are we on a level playing field? And if you do want other options which are perhaps more difficult to achieve, decentralised options, more demand side, then that, I would contend, is perhaps more difficult to do. So, you know, perhaps there is some exclusivity between nuclear and renewables, large scale and small scale, if you look at the way that systems have developed in many other countries. But I can get into that in debate. So just to conclude, because I know I'm out of time, 4 key points to leave you with. First is remaining within the 2 degrees, both globally and the UK's fair share. I think it's very, very challenging, increasingly difficult, because you've got to believe that those kind of emissions reductions are possible, the 9% a year perhaps. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try our best to get near to it. It's not a counsel of despair. For the UK and for the world, there are choices though. How do you get on that pathway and travel along that pathway towards, in our case, our 80% target? It doesn't mean you close down all debate just because it's urgent, and I think there's a temptation to do so. UK policy emphasises do everything, but I don't think it's politically and economically feasible to do everything, and there's an interesting debate to be had about what that actually then means. And of course, carbon isn't the only problem we have to address in the energy sector. There's security issues, of course, affordability issues, and so on. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Right.